Actually, I like the word feast, and I think that so many of us think of it as problems. But if you thought like, well, my life is here, like we're all here. I often love that Mary Oliver quote that you have this one wild and precious life. And it's like, why not make it a feast? Why not literally make it feel good? I think we think, oh, if I do that, I'll be indulgent and I'll pig out, overeat on Thanksgiving. But if you really thought about a feast is the idea of a feast for all your senses. And so if your health is actually about, one of the things in my new spot is that you can do forest bathing because there's trees everywhere. Like that is a feast for the senses and it's really good for you. And yoga is a feast literally for your body because it feels so good.
In a world where the demands of modern life often leave us feeling disconnected from ourselves, it's rare to find someone whose work embodies the power of presence, purpose, and possibility. Hey there, Health Feast listeners. Dr. Rock here, and today Po and I are delighted to welcome Dr. Jessie Mahoney to the feast. Dr. Mahoney is a physician, a mindfulness coach, a yoga teacher, and the host of the Mindful Healers podcast. Jessie and I go way back. We worked together for years at Kaiser Permanente, where she led transformative efforts in physician health and wellness. In fact, as I've talked about before on the podcast, she was the catalyst for my own journey into mindfulness, which has completely changed my life. Her leadership, her wisdom, her approach to cultivating happiness really sparked a pivotal moment for me, and it's one that continues to shape my life to this day. That's why I'm super excited to share this conversation today. Today, Jessie shares her personal journey of, after 2 decades of clinical practice, transitioning her career to her new calling, which is empowering other physicians to find alignment and joy through mindfulness, coaching, and yoga. We delve into the profound impact that mindfulness has on personal and professional well-being, and the ripple effect that her work has had on so many lives, including my own. Jessie offers practical wisdom on overcoming burnout, reframing our relationship with work and purpose, and finding small, meaningful ways to nurture ourselves every day. We also talk about her retreats, her partnership with her husband as they build this new business and life centered on healing and growth, and how yoga can be a gateway to greater awareness and self-compassion. This episode really is a feast for the senses. It's a celebration of the power of small shifts, intentional living, and choosing to create a life that's nourishing and aligned. So, whether you're going for a walk, perhaps relaxing with a cup of herbal tea, maybe stretching out right before bed, prepare to be inspired by Dr. Jessie Mahoney's journey, her wisdom, and the practical tools she shares to help all of us embrace mindfulness, courage, and purpose in our own lives. So let's do the show. Jessie Mahoney, Dr. Jessie Mahoney. So amazing to have you here at the Health Feast. God, it's really a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you for having me. Super fun.
Yeah, you guys, Po and Jessie, you got to meet a little bit beforehand, but we're excited to delve into your story, Jessie. And I was telling Po, and in the introduction, I mentioned a little bit, like Jessie and I, you and I worked together. I think, many years. Yeah. I mean, I was the whole time, most of the time I was there, at our prior medical group, and you were there. And then I think I knew about you before you knew about me. Yeah, for sure. Because Jessie was leading the Physician Health and Wellness committee and efforts really to help address the kind of crisis of physician burnout. Now, I think I would say it's better, maybe. I don't know. I haven't worked in another practice, but I think it's better in where we used to work, and partly in big part because of your efforts. And the reason I'm so excited to have you on, and I'm excited we've stayed in touch, is you really changed my life. And I know that, people say that sometimes and it sounds dramatic, and it is. It's meant to be, because I was super burnt out. I was really depressed. I was bringing all this negative energy home. And then I went to a kind of talk that met requirements we had, educational requirements we had on evidence. It was called evidence-based workplace happiness, Poe, because Jessie always says for doctors, you have to say evidence-based, and otherwise they won't listen, they won't come. And you already go in, like I was going in with like my BS radar, like, what is this? It's not a choice. This isn't a choice. Like that was my assumption back then. And she had us do you remember this? Of course you do.
Yes.
You had us pull out our phones and text someone and just tell them why that we work with, Poe. So to pull out your phone, text someone that you work with and tell them why you appreciate them. And so I texted one of my colleagues. It was in the small office I worked with, Ray Cordero. You remember Ray?
Yeah.
And I said, Ray's like 20 years older than me, and he always gave me advice, and he has 3 kids. And I said, oh, it's just been so amazing to have you as a mentor and a friend. And then we put our devices away. And then Jessie says, how do you feel? A simple question. And I was like, oh shit, I feel better. Like maybe happiness is a choice. So that set me on this whole, that was like a light bulb moment, but then it set me on this whole different trajectory in my life. And I started meditating, and then I discovered healthy eating and all these things. Like now look where I am. I can always like pinpoint to that experience. So anyway, I want to first express that gratitude and tell you that the work you do, even now, all the work you do, which we're going to get into, is like, it has this, I like to say it has this ripple effect, has this butterfly effect. So welcome. And Jessie, tell us a little bit about your journey to what you do now.
Gosh, where to start? So I think I'll start with when we met, because we're on your podcast and that will be fun. And so my journey when I met Rakesh, I know he calls himself Dr. Rock now, but that's not how I can call him. So I'm just going to go by Rakesh.
That's fine.
And we met working at TPMG or Kaiser, and as physicians. And when I met you, I had been working there for about 15 years. And I had been working on physician wellness as part of my leadership roles for almost the entire time, because since I actually started in medical school, I really saw this inherent conflict between how we were taught to tell our patients to take care of themselves versus how we were taught to take care of ourselves. And there was a bit of cognitive dissonance, as you mentioned. We would tell our patients they should sleep and they should eat healthy and they shouldn't be stressed and they should, I'm a pediatrician, so go to the bathroom, and they need to go to the bathroom. And as physicians, and literally most people in healthcare, we are not given the time to do that. We are not encouraged to do that. We tell our patients they should have compassion for themselves and be kind to themselves, and we are the meanest people on earth. And the culture to ourselves, to everyone else, we're lovely. But the culture of medicine from the healthcare provider side has a lot of growth opportunities. And so I saw that very early on in medicine, and I grew up in Berkeley where people speak up. And so I just started speaking up early on. And in medicine, when you speak up, they say, great, why don't you try to fix that? And so early on, I became the chief of wellness at Kaiser South San Francisco, actually, my very first year in practice, because someone was like, this sounds good, you should work on that. But there really were no resources. Nobody talked about burnout. In fact, we didn't really use that word. It was just sort of this dissonance of we used to call it physician health and satisfaction. There wasn't even a wellness word, but we were clear that physicians were not healthy. And that was really the focus. But there was no money, there was no time. There was just very little support for it. And I will say, as you mentioned, that TPMG, from my perspective, was incredibly forward-thinking in even acknowledging this in 2002, even if we met in the back closet with no budget. But they did understand that there was something going on here and things kind of had to change. But it was very slow process. So when I met you, I had been doing that for about 12 years. And we had made a lot of progress. We had budgets, we could do things. And more and more people were listening, because over time, medicine, the system of medicine has gotten more challenging. So when I first started practicing, was really when the sort of healthcare was taken over by corporations and institutions, and we had a lot more managed care. Before that, it was pretty unusual. So that's right when I graduated from medical school. And so I think that medicine has become harder and harder and harder as a profession. And so, as you mentioned before we started recording, that you're not sure it's gotten better. And I would say I think the attention to burnout has gotten better, but the system has gotten more challenging, and the pandemic added challenge. And so, while we've been making progress, we're maybe still in the same spot. I hope we're not further behind. And of course, it's a little bit like autism, I think. Like, we're much more aware of it. And so therefore we diagnose it and we see it more. And when kids were growing up in my timeline, many people had this issue that nobody had a name for. And so now we're just much more aware of it. And so part of it is it worse. The system is having challenges. So it's a very complex issue. So since the time we met, we worked together on wellness for TPMG for quite a while. And I always like to tell people that I held a lot of other leadership roles in medicine because I thought that the change needed to come from the system. And many people say, well, the system is broken. So I thought, well, if I could work on that angle and on wellness, I could solve the problem. I bring that up, one, because I understand the conflict between the two, and there's a real conflict. And I understand, the pressures from the organization and the money pressures, as well as the reality of the people practicing in it. And it has been really instrumental for me in actually stepping out of institutional wellness and believing that the answers can come from us as individuals, and very often it's more effective to approach it from the outside, because within a big institution, it's very hard to make change. So even though I had that role and I did make change in your life, and I actually believe I made change in lots of people's lives.
Yeah.
I got to a point where I felt like, wow, I have all these skills and tools and wisdom. And that, I think, was the sort of theme of what we were going to talk about. And I can only make a little bit of change in a big institution. Again, I always like to say this, not because institutions are bad, not because nobody believed in it, but that's just the structure of
institutions,
of a huge, large institution. And so sometimes working around the outside and getting to know people. Now I work with people all over the country, all over the world, who are in different specialties and work in different practice types. That ripple effect, to me, is more impactful over time. So I've felt very much like this was my mission and purpose. And I do want to say, after watching people like you change your life, I'm like, wow, this stuff works, and wow, I actually have, I won't call it a superpower, but it's really the thing that I just am so passionate about and love. And so to be able to help individuals and then watch the individuals, I just want to say, just like you, find their thing, change their life, and then go out and change other people's lives. Like, how could I not transition to that? So when I left my medical practice, which was right before COVID, I didn't know COVID was coming. And I didn't actually plan to sort of leave medicine, but because of the way the world unfolded at that time, physicians in particular became more distressed, and I became very busy doing what I do, which is primarily working with physicians, but not exclusively. That I really just felt like I had all this tools and wisdom that I needed to share, and I couldn't not do it. And I had, I do a lot of coaching, but I had also been coached, and I had been through my coach training. And this one phrase really resonated to me, which is, what will the world miss out on if you don't follow your dreams or your passion or your superpower or skill set, whatever you want to call it. And that, to me, is like, even as I say it, it's like a little dagger. Like, you just, like, no matter how hard it is, that you can't not do it. And I know that resonates with you, because you were on my podcast the other day talking about, following your dreams, and that I think it's always the harder step to do that. And yet it's also potentially the most rewarding. And I also like to think of it, when we're not in our alignment, it actually leads to a lot of health problems. It leads to a lot of mental health problems, physical health problems. And so when we have this sort of inner knowing, to resist it is, I believe, not healthy. And so I would say that's actually wisdom. I think many of us are doing what we think we should do,
I hear.
and for all of the outside, I was a pediatrician. I had a full practice. I was leading wellness in this institution. I was helping tons of people. And so I also had this thought of like, well, if I don't do that, what will happen? But of course, people have taken over and they have moved on from what I've done, and they're making a difference. And when I coach a lot of people on making changes, to me, it's like you can be complete with something. Your season of that can be complete, and you can be ready for something new. And I think many of us think, especially in a world like healthcare, we have to do the same thing. This is our job, this is our role. And yet maybe we're meant to, in my case, I was meant to be a primary care pediatrician for a while. I was meant to be a hospitalist. I was meant to be a leader for a while. And all that comes with you. So you're never done, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like how many times in the corporate world or any other like world, it's not true across the board, but so many people in professions change the company they work for. It's like in medicine and in government, like people stay with their job.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but yeah, I don't know that anyway.
It's interesting.
Poe, does this, I imagine this resonates with you because
Oh,
we
man.
talk about this a lot in the context of your life and career.
Yeah, well, that's so, man, it's a lot of what you're saying I align with. Well, and it's interesting because I'm kind of going through like sort of like that same process in my life right now. A couple things that I was just kind of writing down, a couple things you were talking about. But what I was going to ask first was, like, for those who are like, let's say electricians, plumbers, first responders, military, like, obviously from your perspective, it's from a doctor's perspective, but I'm definitely sure there's burnout in any line of work. There's burnout, and, I speak for myself in regards to like, being in, law enforcement or corrections. I know a lot of guys that are under a lot of stress and that are burnt out. You know what I mean? So, and what's interesting, and just like what you're saying, we're really good at helping others. Like, we have like this sense of duty and like, what we're here to like, but it also goes, and I wrote down broken system. There's a system that's in play that like, and then you also said something that was really important that I thought was really interesting, is that what you're focusing on now, or at least part of your work now, is really helping the individual to then go back to the system
To go fix the broken system.
Yeah. And my question to that is like, how does one, it doesn't matter what organization or what, or institution, how, like, if the institution or the system is just so massive, at what point does one say, there's some things that you just can't, like, is there ever like this acceptance of like, okay, I'm one little like this little tiny thing, and no matter how much I try, it's, you know what I mean? Like, no matter how far you go up in the ladder, where you get to this level where you have the authority to make the change. Like, what would you say to the people that are in their industries, whatever walk of life they're in, where they choose the careers they're in? Like, how does one, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I'm asking, but I guess we could just start with like, I guess we could just start with.
It's a super good question.
Yeah. So I know it was just a lot of things. I was just trying to write them because I had so many questions and like how you would answer. So I was like, because I'm sure there's people that are going to listen to this.
I think the best way to start with that is to say that you are absolutely right that in every profession there's burnout. And burnout is a human, and I'm going to say / societal problem. And a lot of it comes from the way I'll say American society, but I actually see it in a lot of other cultures too, where we've become so focused on sort of outcomes and achievement as opposed to being in the present and being mindful. And so while what I do now is essentially coach people who are not only burnt out, but are dissatisfied or really wanting to change something in their life. Some people want to change things even before they're burnt out, but that we really do have to show up mindfully for that. And mindfully is noticing sort of how we got there, how we're thinking, what's our responsibility, what's our role, in it. And while all these systems and society has all the stuff going on the outside that's really impacting people in every profession, focusing on, more is better, hard is better. We're actually a little bit addicted to collective suffering, said with a hand to heart, right? And so it becomes this thing like, working women are suffering, and then it's the dads that are suffering, and then it's this and that group, and it becomes this sort of collective suffering that's very draining. And so the way that I like to think about it is to be mindful, notice, and I often talk about sort of default thought patterns that we have that encourage burnout, because this is something we can change. And so when I think about a big institution, and I'm thinking about you working in corrections, like it's a little bit like medicine. Most of that is out of your control. Okay.
Right.
And where we get into trouble, and we were talking about this a little bit at the beginning, is that when things are out of our control, we go into what I call a victim mentality.
100%.
And so then you feel like a victim, and then you're disempowered, and then you're just burnt out, and you don't do anything, and you are focused again on all these things that are out of your control that I often say should be different. Okay, yes, they should all be different. And so what I like to offer is a couple things. You can opt out of victimhood because it's not useful. Even if you are a victim, even if the system's just awful, you can just decide you're not, or decide to just let it be and shift your attention or focus, which is a mindfulness tool. So what am I going to pay attention to? And so this reminds me of a ER doc that I worked with in the South during COVID, and like nobody was wearing masks, nobody was getting vaccinated, everyone was in the halls, they didn't have all the things. And it was like, this should be different, but I can still make a difference. And that difference is focused on what's in your control. And so focusing on, I like to say, what you do, what you say. So sometimes speaking up is needed, sometimes it's not. And how you show up, what you model. And then it's the tone and energy with which you do that. And it's also what you think and feel about it. Okay. So the stories you tell about your organization, because so much of us spend all our time saying this should be different and this is broken. And why aren't they, why are they not valuing me? All of this stuff just makes you feel worse. And so what I like to offer in the mindfulness realm, acceptance is a tenet of mindfulness. And so, in mindfulness, we talk about radical acceptance, which I actually struggle with. So I say accept and accept and means you don't resist the reality of the corrections institution. You don't resist the reality of your healthcare institution. TPMG is as it is. There's a lot of amazing things, and there are things that need improvement. Same thing with where you work. And so this idea of accept what is that's out of your control. And then you get to decide, do you want to be angry about it? Do you want to be empowered? Do you want to be sad? Do you want to be disappointed? A lot of times people think that emotion has to be good. It doesn't have to be. You can be, some things we really want to be angry about. And by not allowing ourselves to do that, we don't move forward. Because say, for example, you accept and are angry that we don't have masks and people aren't getting their vaccines, whatever it is. And then it's like, okay, and I can be angry. I can allow this human emotion, which is human. And what am I going to do? And then all of a sudden you're shifting towards a way that you can show up and make a difference. I'm going to use you as a model for case, right? You're accepting of like all this stuff and you're like, and I can still send a text to my colleague and boy, that feels good. Oh, and I could meditate on the way home and I could opt out of fast food, or I could, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, I feel better and I'm a little bit more empowered. And so that's where each of us as individuals, you then showed up for your team totally differently. And then your team is like, what's he doing? There's a little bit of ripple effect. And then I like to think of what I do now as sort of improving the system one person at a time, because not everybody's ready. But there's enough people that really care and are ready and have this capacity. And we might have a capacity at one time and then something's going on in our life where we don't have capacity, and that's okay. But then we can each be part of the change. And I do want to say that it's not an obligation, because I think sometimes we're like, oh my God, well then I have to do this, so I have to change it. It's like you get to choose. And I also think we tend to be all or none people. So it's like, well, if I can't fix it all, what's the point? And my thought is just do one little thing, or Mindfulness offers this idea. I think it's Rumi that says it's the crack that lets the light in. So I'm always like, you look for the crack. For Rakesh, sending that email was the crack, and it just let the light in, and then the light started to shine, and he changed. And like maybe within your workplace, there's a crack. There's one place where you can make a difference, or maybe it's just you showing up more mindful, or you shifting the focus from all the things that are wrong to maybe, oh, this one thing went right today. And then you begin to change and the ripples happen. Because otherwise we just get focused and stuck on the depressing and the not changing.
Right.
And that's your lens. And so it's choosing your lens gives you a whole different energy and capacity for change. If you want to make it, you can also just feel better yourself. And that helps everybody too.
You talked a little bit about, you're saying that how even if you feel like you're in your alignment with your purpose or, that also helps, because if you don't feel like you're doing what you were designed to be doing, that's going to cause a conflict within, which then the lens you have will always be sort of distorted because you're not. And I can relate to that comment that you made, because as soon as you said that, I was like, man, I do feel like that sometimes, or if not all the time. Talk a little bit about that, like with people that are out there doing what they're not supposed to be doing, and they know it. That's the thing.
Once you've figured out how you're not a victim, because if you're there just noticing everything that's wrong, and we often think that things have to be wrong in order to make a change. And my thought is they don't have to be wrong. They can just be as they are. And so I do a lot of work with people who are transitioning careers or transitioning the kind of medicine that they practice. And what I like to say is you need to clean up your mindset. And I will also say like your heart set, or you're just sort of knowing what you want before you change. Because if you're just changing because it's better over there, you won't be happier over there because you bring your negativity lens.
Yeah.
Right.
And so when you can get to the place, and I have this sense from what you said that you're at that place where you are is fine. It's good. You have ownership of yourself. It sounds like you've made a lot of changes in your health, and you have sort of this clarity, and internally that like, wow, I actually really want something different.
Yeah.
That's the time to make a change. If you're making this change to like, I just got to get away from this, you get to the next thing and you're like, oh, this isn't very good either.
Right.
And so when you can really, I say, clean up your mindset. So you're managing your mind. And it doesn't have to be positive, by the way. A lot of people are like, oh, that's all Pollyanna. I'm like, just don't be negative. Just don't focus on everything that's wrong, because almost everything has some good things and bad things. And every job does. And sometimes when we just get that more balanced perspective, people are like, oh, actually, this is fine. And for some people, the job is really the job, and that's fine for them because they have a passion and a purpose somewhere else. For some people like me, and it sounds like maybe for you, you're like, wow, there's something else here I'm meant to be doing. And when you know that, to not follow that cue is terrifying. But I know, and Rakesh, you actually asked me this before, if I would talk about like this, like, well, then how do you do it? Right? Because we know that, but we're like, oh my God, what do I do?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of fear.
Yes.
Of the unknown. It's the unknown. Why do so many people say in their current situation? Because it's a known commodity.
Yeah. But also say you know that you're not happy.
Yeah, well,
so it's a known
even
commodity.
that is, even that is a known commodity.
Yeah. But so I like to offer to people that uncertainty is actually opportunity. It's possibility, right? You know that like you're sitting there feeling blah, or feeling like, wow, I'm not fulfilling my purpose. So trying something new, our brain says, oh, this has to be the right thing and I have to get it right. But what if you're just going to try it? And what if it's actually better than you thought? Or if you are a catastrophizer, which many of us are, it's like, maybe it won't be as bad as you think. It might be okay. It might turn out okay. Or maybe you're going to take one step and then you'll know which way to go. I remember you saying, Rakesh, that like, well, what's the how of building this whole new thing? And I'm like, oh, you know the how after you do it. You just take one step and then the next step, right? Then you can say, oh, this was how I did it. But most of us are in at least in the medical profession, but I think in a lot of other professions, there's like, you do this, you do this, you do this, and then you go do this. And for many of us, that's actually not fulfilling because we just follow the check boxes. And so when you step off the check boxes. There's some terror there, I will say. Like it takes tremendous courage to do it. Many people want to be confident first. You're not confident till you get to the end. You're like, oh, that's how I did it. I should have been confident.
Very true. Yeah.
So to
your confidence is lowest when you start.
Yes.
100%.
Because you haven't done it yet.
Yeah.
But we think it's supposed to be highest, and we can't do it until we're confident. And so my thought is, if you're afraid, that actually just means you're doing something new. Like many of us say, I'm afraid, danger, don't do it, especially in medicine, right? If you're afraid, it's like that, you're making a mistake. But instead, it's just it's unfamiliar is what I like to say. So uncertainty is just unfamiliar.
I'm gonna say too, like when you guys first start out being doctors, I'm sure your first day on the job, there was some fear there, right? Like for me,
Terrifying.
After the academy, I'm showing up to work. I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. You know what I mean? Like, but they train you just enough to get by your first day. And then once you start stacking those days, you look back and like, oh, I've dealt with that before. Yeah.
Right. But then when we do it again, we're like, oh no, this isn't okay. Like I was comfortable over there.
Yeah, right.
I just think this acceptance of, as you mentioned, just as you can accept the institution, you just accept that change is very challenging.
Yeah.
And you're gonna be stressed, and you're going to somehow we think if I'm going to follow my true passion, I'm not going to be stressed. Well, that's not true, right? Because you got to figure it out. But I think there are some things that you can do. And as I mentioned before, I think there are like wisdoms or unexpected secrets. And one of them is this mindfulness that I keep bringing up. And it's why Rakesh was so successful. He might not know that. But
no, I do know that. Yeah. It's the key. It's the foundation.
It's the missing ingredient, because mindfulness is partly a philosophy, and all the philosophic tenets actually help you change with, I'll say, more grace and elegance, but it's still bumpy. But it's also physiologic. So it's like you're taking good care of your nervous system. So when you are in what we call fight or flight, or cortisol bath, or stress response, like running away from the tiger, nobody changes from there, right? You just react. And so you can willpower your way a little bit, and then you're like, oh, I don't want to do this. And you're just like flipping back and forth all the time and wasting tons of energy. And so mindfulness actually helps you upregulate that other part of your nervous system, which is the calm one. So you're in a little bit more balance. And your body is like, if you think when you're relaxed, you're like, oh yeah, I could do this. Oh yeah, I could try this. And so understanding that you can use your nervous system and work on it by practicing mindfulness, and you don't have to be perfect, by the way. You can just do little bits of things. That really, really helps. The other thing that I think is really important is that I always say you can't hate yourself into change. So you have to be nice to yourself, and you have to. And the science around that is when you are being mean to yourself, not self-compassionate, i.e., what am I doing wrong? Why didn't I do this before? Why did I make a bad choice? Or who do I think I am, to whatever it might be, you are again releasing cortisol and norepinephrine, which are hormones that make your brain kind of like, the simplistic version would be a teenage brain. That's not really, you're not your highest, wisest self. You're just like,
Poe has 3 teenage daughters.
Yeah. Okay, you got it. It's teenage brain. Perfect.
I know exactly what you mean when you say that too. I'm like, oh yeah, I went straight there. I was like, oh yeah, dude.
I'm laughing. That's why I'm laughing.
Some crazy decisions.
So being kind to yourself, just or not terrible, not mean to yourself, like actually shifts that physiology, and all of a sudden you're in a space where you can change much more readily. Because if you can stay into that highest, wisest self brain out of your teenage brain by practicing self-compassion, which we know releases oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, all these good things that make your brain smarter, same brain, then you are much more able to change and have it stick, if that makes sense. And then I think the other thing that many of us don't appreciate is you can't change when I say you're below empty, or your basic needs are not being met. Or
totally.
And I think many of us try to willpower our way forth. But if you think about it, like if you're not eating, sleeping, you're under threat or under siege, or maybe you're in like a really toxic place, it's really hard to get yourself in this state. So I often tell people to think about like energy management. Where can you get some energy? Maybe you need to take a sabbatical. Maybe you need to take some time off. Maybe you need to eat some healthy food. Or, I think in your case, Rakesh, if I just use you as an example, I hope that's okay.
No, it's fine.
I know that you've thrown it all out on my podcast, so I'm sure you do here too, right?
Yeah.
But you made these changes where you like repleted yourself with some kindness to others, and then with some mindfulness, and then with some healthier food. And like
That's
he
right.
just kept repleting himself.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, I don't know, were we 5 years later, 8 years later, you're a totally different
8 years
person.
later? 8 years later.
But you can't, like, without that inner support. So we so often, people are like, yeah, I'm just going to exercise every day. I'm going to do all these things. And like, well, it's really hard to change from there. That's why I love your health feast, right?
Yeah. That's why we name it that. Yes.
What if you feast yourself with like things that feel good? Then all of a sudden change, like I would say, nourish yourself. And I mean, in part by food, but you can nourish yourself with nature or sleep or friends or hugs or, I don't know, arts, like whatever it is. And that actually is what you need to do these things that are hard successfully.
It's making me think of the retreats you lead, which I haven't been on one, but we used to lead some shorter day retreats together. And I see all these amazing, incredible pictures of the places and also the food. You got to tell us about your husband. Has become like a chef,
Well, so my husband's story is actually very interesting, and I might offer that this is evidence of the ripple effect. So I left my employed doctor position, although I see myself as like maybe the doctor for the doctors, if that makes sense. But but I made this transition and was basically kind of following my aligned purpose. And my husband's watching all this. Meanwhile, he works as an attorney and is not in alignment. We'll just say that. In fact, he had some quite significant. What's really interesting is his significant mental health challenge is what got me to say, like, I'm not going to let that happen to me. So I got to follow my passion and purpose now. I don't know if you know that, Rakesh, but that right before, the few years before I changed, my husband actually had, and he's very open about this, really significant depression.
I think you shared that with me in the past.
And he actually was not working for a while. It was like life-changing for me. And I had 3 teenage boys at the time.
Wow.
So, and I was working full-time and I had all these leadership roles and I was like, And what helped me sort of move through that was actually mindfulness and this coaching. And that's where I discovered, I'm like, oh, if you put all these tools with all these other things, I know how to like help people do this. So then I was like, I have to make this change. And so I did that. He watches it. And gosh, I don't know if it was 3 years in, because it was a year ago in April. Well, it was actually about a year ago in January. Oh no, he petitioned actually for 9 months, I'll tell you this. So I was really busy and I was needing to hire someone to help me, but I couldn't figure out who to hire. And because I didn't know what I was doing. This is all a new thing. And like, I hadn't run a business before. So my husband's watching this. And then he said, you should hire me. I was like, are you nuts? Like, I don't want to hire you. You have a good job. And like, this is my like safety raft right over here. But he kept asking and he kept asking. And so one day I was like, well, I guess I could. Like, you actually could help me with a lot of things. And I actually do trust you. And I don't have to worry about like the HR department if I hire you. I don't have to worry about all this stuff. And it also came because he had been being the chef for my retreats. And the retreats that I do coaching, I do mindfulness, I do practice self-compassion, and we sleep and eat healthy food and do all the things. Because when you do it together, right, it's like all works together. Like I just talked about, so it's not that efficient is the goal, but it's fast, right? People make big shifts pretty quickly because they're like, wow, I see it now. When you feel better, you see it. And so he had been doing that while doing his legal job, which is a little bit challenging. He would actually like do the whole plant-based breakfast, and then he would go upstairs and be in court on the computer, and then he would come back to like.
Oh wow!
And so I knew that was also not sustainable. But it was a week here there was not a big deal, and I was doing a lot less of them because that was all he could do. So, and at any rate, he said he wanted to join me. So the one day that I was like, okay, I guess that could work, he literally went home and quit his job. Just like that. So I wouldn't change my mind.
Wow.
And now he works with me full time. And it's actually lovely because he does a lot of the things that cause me stress because he knows how to do them because we have a very different skill set. I don't do
nice.
contracts, negotiations, none of that. But that doesn't stress him out in the least.
Wow.
Right.
Because that's what he always did.
That's what he always did, yeah.
Yeah. But he also, which you can see really, so that's sort of like the part of the job that's like, it's fine. It doesn't stress him out, but he doesn't love it. But he loves to create food and healthy food, but also beautiful food.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
it.
his food is not just
It's
like
so
it's
beautiful.
nourishing and it's mostly plant-based. I'll just be clear, not totally. But he makes it really beautiful. And that actually came before he went to law school, which he really did just to support his family, for being totally honest. He worked in restaurants for 10 years. And so he has a background in this. And he worked in some spiffy restaurants with famous chefs where he watched what they did. And so they made food look beautiful. And they actually thought, and this is very relevant to your podcast, that you taste with your eyes. Is
Yes.
what they say. And
You
so
eat with your eyes first.
yeah, so you look at it first, and then you actually only need like half of it because you're already filled with like this beauty and wonder and awe. And
Right.
and so part of it is that, he's sharing that experience with many people who've never had it. And many people who come to my retreats are not vegetarian and have not ever eaten plant-based, but they're like, wow, it can look like this, it can taste like this. So it's nourishing them. But, and many people have said this, when you watch him in the kitchen, like you can see that the whole process is nourishing him. And so the food also has this like love in it because you can just see this person. People say that, like, I just love watching him in the kitchen. And it's not like a restaurant where everyone's going crazy. It's like just him doing his thing. And so I think to realize that there can be this just whole circle of it and that there's all these little pieces that can get added in and you don't need all of them, but that it's really kind of a beautiful thing. So you making a change can inspire
Someone
a
else.
loved one making a change, and then that is kind of a ripple effect down the line, if that makes sense.
Wow. Are you a good boss?
But apparently you'll appreciate this. I have high expectations.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Like,
I know
he
you
knows
do.
he's worked with me. I have high expectations.
You have very high expectations. Yeah.
Yeah. We have different expectations. So thankfully, we're still working it out. But actually, I had this retreat this weekend, which I do with my podcast host once a year. And she is from San Diego. So she came up to do it. And she said, like, oh my gosh, like your husband looks completely different than when I met him 2 years ago. Which I just thought was like,
in terms of like his mood and his energy,
she was just
and
like everything,
because he's living his passion. He's
Yep.
doing something he really believes in, lights him up. He's showing love through food.
and it makes a difference. I think that's the other piece.
That's it.
For me, is when you're doing something that feels aligned. Most of us want to do good things for the world and want to make change and want to help people, like especially in the helping professions, right? And so when we see the impact of that, it's so, what's the word? Refilling, rejuvenating,
fulfilling,
nourishing, whatever that word is.
Yeah.
And so it's this, like, it feeds on itself. Because I often tell people, they're like, oh, your life is so great. I was like, I work twice as much as I used to, but it feeds me and every bit of it feeds me. And so, well, I do have to remember to take breaks because I actually don't, because I'm just doing something that,
This just came up. So yesterday I was in my house because yesterday I put out a newsletter every Monday, and yesterday I was like kind of working on it a lot throughout the day, like with the family and doing what I needed to do. Like I made dinner, but then I would go kind of. And then this morning, my wife and I had a conversation where she said, because my newsletter was actually about like not being busy and using your time intentionally.
Yeah.
And she said, do you see any irony?
Yeah.
And then I said, well, because on the one hand, I was like, I didn't feel like I enjoy that. But on the other hand, like what I asked people to do was reflect on their values and ask, is the time, the free, I think that's such a misnomer, by the way, free time. It's like actually expensive time, because anything you can choose how to spend your time is like not
it's
free.
It's time. It's just a
It's
choice.
just time.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was like, if your time could be in alignment with your values. And so I was reflecting on that a lot.
I think that's not busy. So I like to say, like, busy is doing things that are not feeding you. You're just busy. And so
they're energy
your
drainers.
newsletter's totally in alignment, because you weren't being busy. You were
Yeah.
following your passion, which is not busy work, right?
Yeah.
Busy work is just energetic expenditure.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm going to bring that back.
I often say too that we are in our culture like addicted to busy. Like there's free time and busy and work hard and play hard, and like the better people are busier all the time. But busy is just like a thing. It's not a state that many of us want. You mentioned something at the beginning, which I did want to reflect on. And it was asking, I apparently asked you, I don't remember asking you this, but I'm not surprised when you said it, which is, how do you feel after you sent that text?
That's right.
And one of the things that I do in the coaching work, and coaching is really about like using your mind strategically so that you can figure out, how are you living a life that feels more aligned, or that feels good. And so I like to think about, many of us don't know what we want to do in life, but we know how we want to feel. We all know how we want to feel. And so that, like, giving you a taste of how you want it to feel, you were like, well, I want more of that. And so I often ask people that question in the very beginning of coaching. I don't ask them like, what job do you want, or what changes do you want to make? It's like, how do you want to feel in your life? And they all know. And then you can start to work backwards. Okay, well, because there's clues in that. And I always start with, how do you feel right now? Which is usually not how they want to feel, because if they're coming to coaching or to work with me, they're usually not feeling like they want to feel. But sometimes it's really just shifting and realizing that, like, they do feel that way some days, but maybe they don't notice it, or maybe it doesn't have to be a whole career change either. I think it's sometimes really subtle.
Yeah, you mentioned something earlier. You said, like, sometimes people have, like, and you probably work with people, because I was curious, like, what percentage of the people you work with, like, end up leaving there, like, come to the realization that, like, oh, I need to actually leave this and do something different, versus like, oh, I can do this job, shift perspective, and I have other things outside of work that fill me up.
I'm trying to think of the percentage. So certain people work in certain places and what I'll say is that generally they work for a pretty good place that's not toxic. And most of them actually stay when they figure out their mindset. So most people who work where we used to work, I've had one of probably, I don't know, 100 or 200, I'm not sure, leave. And that was really because of some other reason, like there was this great opportunity. And so if you work for a place that's generally a good place, that generally has good intent and is doing the best they can in an imperfect system, if you can work on your mindset and the way that you sort of own how you show up, as we mentioned, like not being a victim, most people can find a way to continue to do that because it works pretty well and have a passion outside. But there are some people like me, for example, who really have a passion that they want to pursue outside. And for those people, they do need to make a change. And so I do work with a fair number of people, mostly I think because they come to me because they see that I've made the change and they know they really want to make a change. So they want the support to do that. And they're wanting to build a lifestyle medicine practice, or they're wanting to, sometimes they're wanting to do something completely not related to medicine at all. And they've always wanted to. And they did this because maybe it was their parents' dream, or maybe because they didn't know what they were getting into, but they really want to be, I don't know, an interior designer or something like that. And so, I think there are people like that who have a dream that they've just been suppressing, or they didn't feel like it was acceptable to pursue. But I think, it's most important that people get to a point where they don't feel victimized and they feel like they have this, the agency and control of their life to choose what they want. And what I really like is when you get people into this choice, many of them choose to stay where they are and think about it differently and realize that like, well, my life is actually, and this is true for most of us, our life is probably 90% the way we want it to be. And there's just this little 10% that needs some tweaking.
Yeah.
And yet we allow ourselves to be miserable because of that 10%. Whereas if you just maybe change what you eat, or you move, or you even just think differently, or or decide not to focus on something, that then things are better. So it could be that you need to change your relationships, or you change where you live.
Boundary or setting boundaries probably comes up a lot in your work.
Yeah. Well, and noticing a lot of us approach our jobs, and I'm thinking this is probably true in Poe's job too, from a place of like, we're supposed to sacrifice. We're supposed to be a martyr. We're supposed to people please. We're supposed to be perfect. And when we aspire to that, we end up sacrificed, a martyr, exhausted, resentful. And so I like to, when I really help people see that, like, wow, if that's your driving force, you're not going to like any job. And many of us were raised that like a good person does sacrifices and does this. And we often use this word, and I know it's a bit controversial, but this word service, which I don't love, because service comes from the root servant, and it's really depleting of yourself. And my thought is, what if we use the word, for example, care? Caring for others, caring for yourself. The
Or
energy is
support.
totally different.
Yeah.
You're still caring. In fact, many people actually do more, but it's in a energizing, refilling kind of way. And so it's often just in the way we describe what we do and the way we think about it, and looking at a lot of these like back tendencies, making decisions from fear or guilt, or many of us have a over responsibility problem. I had that. I still do a little bit. We take responsibility for things that are not ours, like how our children do. And like our responsibility is to show up and provide opportunities, but not provide every opportunity. And, they still get to make mistakes and have problems. Like that's how you become a human. But if it's our responsibility to do all of that, then we're miserable. And so kind of stepping out of that, we can actually begin to enjoy our life often without changing a thing.
So I had a question. I was just listening to, because we're talking about those, there's different types of change. There's like walking away from an old career, or there's shifting your perspective in your current career. What would you say to those who are like, who want to walk away, but their biggest fear is the financial part? I'm sure you had to think about that when you left your career, right? And I'm sure this is a question that people, because
it's terrifying.
It's like, you got a family, like how do you coach, and what kind of, tips and wisdom? Because I obviously there's also the perspective of an abundant, like you got to have an abundance mindset with this. Like otherwise the fear will be too big. Like, scarcity mindset of like, oh, well, if I leave, then all is going to come crumbling down. Right.
And so part of it is, it might not, it might work out fine. We're trained, like, society benefits from us thinking that we need all this stuff or terrible things will happen. And we need corporations benefit because if we don't stay, you will starve to death. Right. And yet for most people in the world, that doesn't happen. And I think I'm going to borrow what you said actually in the podcast that we did, which is like, you can invest in yourself, believe in yourself. He said, pick yourself, I think were your words.
Bet on yourself.
Bet on yourself. That was your word. And I think for many people, I start to say like, well, what if you bet on yourself? Like, why decide that someone else can do it better? And yet I think you have to do it in a way, I mentioned that nervous system thing. Because if your nervous system is like really freaked out, i.e. your family is really in danger of not having their basic needs met, then it's probably actually not a smart thing to do, to just jump off a cliff. But could you do it slowly, or set yourself up where I'm thinking here, you're doing this podcast, this is something you're interested in, you start growing there, and then you make it change more slowly. And I will actually give myself as an example that and I didn't actually have any idea I was going to change when I did this. But if I look back, that's how it unfolded. I hired a coach for myself. I found the process like so inspiring and illuminating that I was like, I'm going to go become a coach to figure this out. Cause I had no plans to be a coach, actually. I just wanted to do the training so I could understand it. And I think my initial idea was that I was actually going to do it at my old job. I'll figure out how to weave this in. And I actually tried doing a bit with patients, but the way that I do it doesn't really work in a 15-minute doctor appointment. It's just not. Um, and I think that our institution wasn't ready for that. They actually probably will be in 5 or 10 years, but I didn't want to wait. That's sort of and then I did yoga teacher training. And then I sort of, so I had set myself up. It was probably, I didn't know I was doing this, but it was a 5 to 8 year process or really it was 20 years because I worked in wellness the whole time, right? So it's like, my thought is do a little bit more. We think I got to just jump off a cliff, but like do 1% more or 5% more of what you want and grow this so that you're not jumping off a cliff. Because it's almost mean to yourself to say, I got to just do this right now. And if you're putting your family in peril, then that would be dangerous. But I would caution that we often think we're putting people in danger when actually you're like, oh, we might actually be okay. Because remembering that society benefits if it's like, you have to have this thing or something like that's a whole advertising promise is if you don't have this thing, something bad will happen.
Right.
That's our training of our brain is like, oh, I can't do that because something bad will happen. But you do have to, and that I think is the value of working with a coach is to kind of figure out like, is this just a thought, like a scarcity mindset or a making decisions from fear? Or if there's a reality, it's mean to yourself. So we don't use things like coaching and this thought work. Well, some people do, but it's really important not to use it to put yourself in, I'll use the word danger or harm's way or, I do see that sometimes people are like, they just jump off a cliff with no parachute. That's actually not kind, by the way. And so figuring out, well, I don't know how one builds a parachute, but that's what I would think about is like, how can you shift slightly? And I think many people also find that as they shift, they become stronger and more empowered, and maybe they're more likely to be successful. Or maybe that's enough that what they do is okay. Like, I think part of our culture these days is like, you just got to go pursue your passion and don't do any of this.
Right,
and there's
right.
a place in between for most people.
That's wisdom right there. That's a lot of wisdom. That's really cool. Thank you. I wanted to circle back to yoga because first of all, super fascinating. Like not many people do that. You can speak to like the arduousness of the process of becoming a certified yoga teacher. It's like how many hours of? I don't
200,
know.
but it's not arduous. I will actually,
well, it's enjoyable, I guess,
It's enjoyable. Exactly. And I often tell people who love yoga to go do the training, even if you don't want to teach, because you learn so much about yourself. It's very healing, and you learn so much about beautiful life philosophies. One of the yoga philosophies, and I also have to say, I love learning new things. So for me, going to school, if you want to call it that, is one of my favorite things. I'm now on my 3rd coach training because I like the different philosophies and the different ways, and that for me is an enjoyable thing. But the philosophies that you learn in yoga teacher training are phenomenal life philosophies. And there's lots of places you can do it, but the community of people that choose to do that is very soul filling. And one of the main tenets of yoga is ahimsa, which is do no harm. And, in medicine, we do no harm to other people, but we forget about ourselves. But in yoga, and in many careers, that's the case. In yoga, it's do no harm to yourself first. Because by doing harm to yourself, you actually can't show up as a fullest version of yourself to help others.
Yeah.
And it also includes things like do no harm to the environment. So they would encourage you to eat vegetarian, plant-based diet, do no harm to others, do no harm. It's like this very beautiful. So there's so much philosophical stuff in yoga, which in our country, we've kind of appropriated yoga as its exercise. When true yoga is not really about exercise, it's a mindset. It's I would say it's like an approach to life. And we say as teachers, like what you do on the mat, you carry forth afterwards. So there's a lot of intention setting. there's a lot of which is like being deliberate and connecting with how you feel. It's really a practice of bringing your mind and body back to the same place, which is health, the essence of health. I'm going to say that's a health feast right there. Like yoga feels like a health feast. But I very intentionally teach yoga from that way. So it's really kind of a mind-body experience. And I also say, because many people think like, I'm not a yoga person, I can't stand on my head, I'm not flexible. And there's a way to practice it that anyone can do, that they can get benefit from. And I think it's really powerful. You have to find, and I'll say a good teacher or someone who understands sort of the philosophy and how to tailor it to each person. And so yoga can look like almost anything. And I think when you begin to understand that, it's really an amazing thing. I will say that for anyone who wants to learn more, I did a podcast recently on how anyone can do yoga and like why, if you think you're not a yoga person, what yoga is actually. And because I get this question a lot. So it's kind of an interesting thing to listen to.
Why don't we, we'll link that in our show notes. Yeah, that sounds.
So did you have a more specific question about yoga or?
Well, yeah. Well, that was one of my questions actually, was like a lot of people, they see it as something other that they couldn't do. I say men especially, right? Women gravitate more towards yoga. Yeah. So now I've been practicing actually for the last year pretty regularly, like a few times a week with an online program that's specifically for men. But it doesn't actually, like, it's sort of devoid of the spiritual side. I do it because he explains how it should feel in the body really well and not how it should look. And I love that program, but you're right. Yoga from its like root, I mean, it means union. It means union of the mind and the body. And yoga isn't necessarily just, right? Correct me. It's like not just the
it's not the poses at all.
It's not the poses at all. It's
actually are just a means to an end.
Right. Which is this to get to this union state, like this sort of meditative state, and that the poses actually facilitate so that you become less aware of your body.
Yeah. Well, more and less aware.
Like so aware that like you don't even, you fall away from like this physical reality. I would say
like you're just at one with your body. Like you don't have the noisy, and well, we all have a little bit because we're imperfect humans. I would say the byproduct is a healthier body and a stronger body, but that's not the intention per se. And so I do think that if people could understand yoga, especially men probably, more of them would do it and would really, really benefit. I also think that the way that we've brought yoga, at least into our culture, is that it actually doesn't suit men that well. Like it's all about stretching and doing this and doing more of this. And so when I have men in my groups, you all need double blocks. Like the blocks are too small for you. Like you actually need more. It's not that you're worse. You're just there.
We're just not as flexible.
You're not as flexible.
Our bodies are different.
Your body looks different. So you need 4 blocks when they only give you 2. So it's no wonder it's like stretchy and uncomfortable. Your bodies look different when you do yoga. And so you're like, well, I don't look like that thing I'm supposed to look like. So I think that it really is important to find either a good teacher or a studio that's welcoming. And, for all the sort of online negativity, I think online yoga is really amazing for people who want to try it because no one's watching you. You're in this little box and you can turn the video off if you don't want to, and you can just try it. And I mean, the key thing is to not get injured and to not push yourself and to not do something that hurts. And that is the benefit of being in a studio because someone can say like, oh, just move your foot over here. But I think there's also benefits to the online because you can just try it and see. And
that's right.
Yeah, I can't say that I'm practicing now, but I've had some experiences with yoga like a few years ago. And I would have to say that my experience of it is like this sort of mind-body connection and like sort of like an active meditation. Because like, when you're in a position and you're like, your body is like stretching and you're like thinking, man, can I do it? And then like you guys are saying, if you have a good instructor that kind of like breathe through the
Yeah.
stretches. So then
Yeah.
you're having this conversation with what you can and what you can't do. And usually if you do it for several, weeks at a time, that's when I feel like that's when you really start seeing like, man, I couldn't do this last week. And then now I'm able to kind of do, touch my toes or whatever the stretch is. But for me, just like I now that we're talking about it, I kind of want to, start thinking about getting online or something because yeah, it definitely does sort of really kind of clears that communication that you have with your body, especially if you're like injury prone or like if you have injuries, it's kind of a lot of times we're not in our body. In my experience, we're sort of thinking outside all the time. All the craziness in the mind, your mind's always thinking about. So I think that goes back to what you were saying about being mindful is another great practice for that. But yeah, I definitely think that yoga and you know what I think too, as far as like why it's just the way it's when it's commercialized, right? It changes how they market it to us. So then it's marketed towards women, not marketed towards men, even though the benefits are also there for men as well.
You mentioned something about it being a moving meditation, and I'm always transparent. So I did yoga because I couldn't. I gravitated to it during this time when my husband was really sick and I had all this stress, and I could not sit and meditate because it was too much going on. So as great as Rakesh is at doing all his things, he doesn't know this, but at the time I was not able to do that. So when I went to yoga, I could move. And I could be totally in that meditative state, but actually moving physically. And so I encourage people who have so much like stuff going on that sometimes that is what you need. And it's not like moving fast because you're actually moving slow, but it allows you to get out of that, like when you just can't do it, because sometimes we can't. And so it's a beautiful sort of transition way. Now I can sit because I'm in a different state, but just to understand that, and it also has a flow. So there's like a little bit of sitting and then there's movement and then there's more flow. So it allows you to sort of work with where you are a little bit more easily than sit here on your mat and meditate, which for many people sounds easy, but it's not easy. So we have to start where we are.
Yeah, Jessie, you just brought up a good point that I was just thinking, like, for those that are like driving home when they're listening to this podcast right now, like, I know in my experience, like, there's a lot of times you're just thinking of all the things that you got to take care of. Like, you're just outside. You're like, oh, I got this appointment this day. Oh, this payment is due. Da, da, da. So, like, how does one? Because I know what we're talking about are things that feed up that like self care. Those are all things that take care of yourself. But I'm like, and myself included. How do you get someone who's not used to that at all? Like they're so used to being outside their bodies than within themselves that like, if they're driving right now, like what would be like an initial step they could just take just so that they can be like, I need to just start doing that, Could you offer some wisdom with that?
The first one is breathing. And this is kind of funny because when I did yoga teacher training, I hadn't noticed this before. Doctors don't breathe. They hold their breath all day long. And I would be at all the doctor meetings and I'm like, oh my God, because in yoga, you learn how to breathe. And I'm like, wow, none of those people are breathing. No wonder they're stressed. And so literally, if you're driving in your car, you can literally start by breathing with intention. So like breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. There's all kinds of fancy breathing we teach in yoga. But honestly, if you just pay attention to your breath and notice, like, do you breathe like 1/4 of your lungs? Do you breathe half? Most people breathe only 30% of their lung volume. And I will say that doctors breathe about 10% until they're aware of it. And we were wondering, like, why do I feel so terrible? Well, just breathe a little bit. And so if you think of it as like as simple as pausing and breathing, I often say just pause and breathe. That can help. And then you can graduate. I also think, from the yoga perspective, you don't have to do a whole yoga class. Like a lot of the work that I do, and this strikes me as something that in your profession might be really helpful, is around shift workers. Like I teach restorative yoga, but you can have one pose. You go home and you do your one thing, like put your feet up the wall, or my favorite is supported fish, where you're really opening your chest because I used to be like this all day. Right? And so, but again, everyone has their pose. There was a physician at my retreat this weekend who had never done supported fish. And she was like, oh my God, that 5 minutes changed my life. I'm going to go home and get these 2 blocks, which 2 blocks is $10, like on Amazon. It's not complicated. She was like, I'm just going to do that every day. And we think, well, I have to get to the class and I have to have an hour. But once you acquire some of these things, you literally putting your feet up the wall is kind of like what it sounds. You put your rear end as close to the wall as you can, and you put your feet up, and you put your arms out, and you lie there, and 5 minutes later, you feel a lot better.
Yeah, your low back gets this like immense relief from that. Yeah, I've done that.
But you don't have to, like, I think we think, oh, I gotta to do that self-care, I gotta climb a mountain, or I gotta
You can even put it on the couch.
Yeah.
You can put your legs on the couch if you
my
don't.
rower.
Yeah.
So I think part of it is just dabbling and looking a little bit and saying like, oh, maybe I'll try that, or trying one thing. That makes sense.
Yeah, you turned me on to breathing, I think, Jessie.
Yeah.
Like years ago. And then Poe, we used to lead these physician wellness retreats and at the Zen Center, which is Jessie, I think you still lead retreats there sometimes.
Yeah, I was there all weekend.
And and it was beautiful, like communal farm, like this. It's just a really amazing place. And so when we did like an iteration of it, it was like, well, what do you want to do? Oh no, this is actually the virtual one we did. I think it started, or maybe. Yeah. Oh, you weren't with us at that point.
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay. So then you don't know this. So then I created a breathwork session.
Yeah.
And I got really into it. And I do breathwork every morning. So another kind of ripple from that whole experience.
But I think it can be simple. Like people hear the word breath work and they're like, oh my God, I can't do that. I'm like, well, you know how to breathe. So pay attention to your breath.
It's what you said. Yeah. It's paying attention and taking
intentional breaths. The other one I love for people who are just trying to start, and this came to mind because you're driving in the car is what you mentioned. And I love Headspace is the one I like only because I started with it. So you can listen to any app. But I often tell people, and I know that you tried this, Rakesh, pull over and do 5 minutes.
Oh yeah, that's what I did. Yeah.
Secret I like to tell though, you can do 5 minutes and actually meditate. But my biggest life revelation on this whole journey came when I was sitting in traffic, listening to Headspace, but not meditating because I was actually driving. But the whole way to Mission Bay, which is where I used to work, I was listening to this episode. And by the time I got to work, I had this whole revelation about all the things in my day I was resisting. It was a pack on acceptance, which you mentioned. And I was like, wow, I'm like making myself miserable before I've even left the parking lot. I was resisting the robot in the garage and the elevators and we used to have to badge in, but the badging in place wasn't next to the stairs, and my brain said it should be because they want us to take the stairs, and then you had to cross this dangerous intersection, and the fire doors were heavy. Like I hadn't even gotten into work, and I was exhausted from resisting all of this. And so I bring this up because while I don't actually advocate meditating while driving, what that tells you is that when you have that soothing voice and they play that kind of music, and even though you're not meditating, you're sitting there and they tell you to breathe, so you're driving and you breathe, like all of a sudden I had all these epiphanies, and literally my whole life changed on that one drive listening to Headspace. So I was not even actually technically meditating, but that's the power of a calm nervous system. And I was able to have a calm nervous system even while sitting in traffic, which normally would have made me anxious, which is why I put it on. So I was like, now I'm going to be late. And I was like, maybe I'll listen to Andy from Headspace. I don't get any money from Headspace, by the way. I just like Andy's voice, and I don't love all the tech, and that's the first one I found, and I know how to use it. So I just use it.
That's the one I started using back in 2016.
Yeah.
I was like, well, that's the one she recommended. And I think back then there weren't like a bunch of options. Yeah. So I would just go in the parking lot near the city college we live by and hit play. And it'd be 10 minutes, 11 minutes, 9 minutes, whatever.
They even have, by the way, now 1 minute. 1 minute, right. 3 minutes. So my thought is you just start where you're starting. Like our brain wants to make huge change. I'm like 1%. Take some breaths, maybe listen to 3 minutes of a podcast, or put it on in the background and just let it absorb rather than listening to, no offense to NPR, but listening to some stressful political thing that makes it so you can't breathe. Like you can use your commute as a time to just listen to something peaceful. And that can help.
Advice.
And what's interesting is it doesn't cost you anything. You can do it, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to a yoga class or, you know what I mean? It's literally like being mindful of like, okay, if you're having a moment, park somewhere, you know what I mean? Turn on some relaxing sounds and take deep breaths. So yeah.
Yeah.
Very practical.
Keep it simple.
Right.
Jesse, I love that you said you're like the healer for the healers,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. It's and you're making like, you're growing in that sense. So recently you moved to like a retreat space. So tell us
Yeah,
about that
farm.
and what your sort of intention and plans are, because I'm really excited.
Yeah. Well, I had been doing retreats and workshops all over. And I really have always wanted to. I moved up to West Marin, and we spent tons of time up here when our kids were young, hiking, and I just love the area. And so my kids all are now gone. I'm an empty nester, and so we had been looking for a place, and we found this place that we love that um, allows for space to do those workshops and do yoga and have my husband cook and grow the vegetables. And there's a whole lot of healing in that sort of growing and picking. And so we've kind of, I won't say gone back to nature, but really sort of back to those things that feed you. And so this allows me a lot more flexibility to work with not just individuals, but teams of people, and do my retreats tend to be small. And so I can gather people and really adapt the experience to the way that I know. I always like to say I do this because I like to do the things I know work best. And when you're in someone else's environment, you can't always do that. And so this was honestly has been a dream of mine for a long time. Many people are like, oh, your dream came true. And part of me says that. And the other part of me says like, wow, I've been working really hard at this for a really long time. Like it didn't just happen. It was a lot of intention and courage and bravery. And I will say it's also not easy. Like, it takes a lot of thought to figure it out. But it's absolutely beautiful. And there's, I'm very much energetically inclined, and you know how the energy at the Zen Center is amazing. The energy here is like that. And now I get to live in that energy, which is amazing. And a lot of people say, well, why would you want to live where you work? And I'm like, why not? Like, I'm really sort of embodying that. And it gives me this ability to share it in a different way. And so I feel like I now am, I've resourced myself in this way that's going to make it even easier to spread those ripples, if that makes sense. So
Really
I love
cool.
it. And I have, we've only been here a couple months, but I have my first big retreat coming up in less than 2 weeks. So we've spent the last few months like figuring it out. We're still, but
Do you only host and work with physicians, or are other people?
No, well, I primarily work with physicians, but that's primarily because I am one. So physicians like working with a physician.
Yeah, right.
Right.
But I have, in terms of my coaching, I have worked with a fair number of lawyers, struggle with the same thing. And that probably comes from the fact that my husband's a lawyer. So I happen to know lawyers in my world, and they know each other. And a lot of people who are physicians have referred friends who are not physicians. So I actually work with anybody online. And then the retreats so far, until I came here, have been all physicians. But I am doing some where it's like people are bringing sisters or friends or spouses and sort of growing it that way. And at some point, I will probably do all comers, but I'm working up to that.
Oh, cool.
But you don't have to, I think for people who aren't physicians, I tend to want to work with them online first so I know them. And then sometimes, as long as they fit in and they kind of are a fit with the way that I work, then it doesn't matter. I was explaining actually this weekend at our retreat, some of the retreats I do, people will bring spouses, which is really, really helpful, because if your partner is exposed to the same philosophies and the same approach and they're understanding this mindset work, I also think it's amazing for when you have someone who is not doing what you're doing. It's kind of a fact check. It's like, wow, that's unusual. Like they don't really, and so it brings everybody back into this common humanity space, which is part of self-compassion, because we're all human and we actually all have these struggles. And I think we sometimes get into, well, I do this profession and it's worse here and it's worse here, and we're victims of this. And so when you actually bring humans together and we can share our humanity, we're all children of somebody. Most of us
See,
are parents. Most of us are a sibling of some kind, and we live in communities. And this work is so important for all of it.
Yeah. I haven't had the opportunity yet to
Yeah, you're
attend
going to come soon.
one of your retreats, but yeah, soon.
I will say, as we get to the end, I know I do teach yoga online, and it's free,
Oh,
and
that's right.
anybody can
Yeah.
come.
Oh, yeah. You do a free class every week. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to
yeah.
start coming to that.
Yeah, so it's most Saturdays. So my son is
Oh,
getting married
that's
next
fine.
Saturday, so there won't be a class next Saturday. And but people who are on my email list, like I send an update if I'm not teaching for some reason. I also have, for those of you who can't come to the live classes, I have a YouTube channel now, because what happened is these classes started during COVID as like I can help my colleagues through this really difficult time. And people kept coming and coming. And so I've been doing them for 4.5 years now. And so about a couple months in, I realized that I should record them and put them somewhere.
And share
And
them.
so my
Yeah.
erstwhile teenagers said, you put them on YouTube, Mom, and this is how you do it. And now I have a YouTube channel with like over 300 classes.
Oh, cool.
And so those, of course, you can do anytime, which is beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, wow, that's amazing.
So,
Wow.
and you can just do part of it. If you're just starting, you just do the introduction, or you just do the Shavasana part, or I
Yeah.
always tell people, they're like, well, I can't do a whole hour. I'm like, you just turn it off. It's YouTube. Nobody's watching, right? We just start where you
That's right.
are.
Okay. Poe, you wanna do the honors? Ask our
yeah. So usually,
final.
one of our questions that we ask our guest is, if you were to, obviously, the name of our podcast is the Health Feast. This is the Health Feast. If you were to bring, I mean, you've shared a lot of great philosophies already, but
That's right.
would you, what other, or you can elaborate on the ones that you've already shared. What kind of life philosophy or advice that you would be bringing to our Health Feast?
I think actually I like the word feast, and I think that so many of us think of it as problems. But if you thought like, well, my life is here, like we're all here. I often love that Mary Oliver quote, that you have this one wild and precious life. And it's like, why not make it a feast? Why
Mm,
not literally make it feel good? And I think we think, oh, if I do that, I'll be indulgent and I'll pig out, like, overeat on Thanksgiving. But if you really thought about a feast, is the idea of a feast for all your senses. And so if your health is actually about, one of the things in my new spot is that you can do forest bathing because there's trees everywhere. Like that is a feast for the senses, and it's really good for you. And yoga is a feast literally for your body because it feels so. And so what if you thought about that feast? And I'm going to offer to you, even though you work in corrections, right? There's still feast in your head, or there's a feast of like, I'm going to show up as a caring human. Like we can get at this feast in different ways. And so I think I actually spent a year focusing on this word luxurious, which sounds really nutso, but I had spent my whole life like kind of thinking that working hard and sacrificing and like that was the way to like live, and that was a better person. And I was like, actually the way to live is to like live well, meaning take good care of yourself and invest in yourself and do things that feel good, because when you do that, you feast on yourself. You actually are much better able to feast on the world, if that makes sense. So that's really why I think the work that I do is so important, because it really shifts that lens. So most people come because they're struggling and they want something to change. It's really approaching it in this way that if you're thinking about it that way, everybody wants to do the work because it feels so good. And it doesn't even feel like work, as you were saying, right? It's feasting on something that makes you come alive. I always say the world doesn't need people to do what the world needs. It needs people who've come alive, like bring their genius and their energy. And that's what I love about this feast idea. Just like, what if we all feasted and shared the feast? And that would be really better.
You're bringing feast to the Health Feast. I love it. I love it. That's the Poe, that might be one of my favorite answers right there.
And I didn't think about that in advance. Just like,
No.
so it was this conversation that
Yeah.
had.
Jessie, how do people find out about like working, if they want to work with you or get your free yoga classes or just you write also, right? Do you have a blog or a news?
Yeah. And so if you go to my website, that's the easiest, which is either pauseandpresence.com or my name, Jessie Mahoney, MD.com. And there's all kinds of tabs. So you can listen to the Mindful Healers podcast. You can click on the yoga tab and you sign up and get the emails that tell you when yoga is. You can sign up to get the blog. You can find out about coaching. You can find out about retreats. Everything's there. So play around with it. And actually, you know what's fun? I'm just thinking, I created the website. It's actually kind of like a feast, since we're talking about feasts. A lot of websites have a lot of words and they're like trying to energize you. And it's full of beautiful pictures, beautiful food and beautiful scenery. And it's,
I love that.
It was very intentional because I think it's how you feel when you're there. And I was like, that's what I want to put out in the world. Like, not like, are you miserable? This is how you got to do X, Y, and Z with that scarcity urgency. But just the sort of peacefulness of how you make decisions and what you're going to, dabble into the feast of tabs. I'll say like the choices.
Wow.
And that's just really important, what you put out in the world intentionally in the energy that we share. So if nothing else, go look at the pretty pictures. Join with free yoga. Listen to the Mindful Healers podcast is really intended for all. There's lots of fun wisdom.
That's right.
I do a lot of parenting. Parent with presence because I'm a pediatrician. We do a lot of relationship stuff, a lot of mindfulness stuff. It's kind of fun and interesting, and you can hear Dr. Rock on there.
Yeah,
last week.
This is you've been doing your podcast for like 4 or 5 years now.
4 years.
4 years now. Yeah, and someone I went to college with who doesn't even live here, like heard me on your podcast.
Yeah,
I was like, whoa, that's cool.
Yeah.
Like that's really cool.
You've come twice now, so well done. Yeah.
Okay, wow, this was so awesome. Like, I really like a gift. Really, just fun to connect with you and also recount like how impactful you've been in my life. And then, I think you can understand why now.
Oh yeah.
Right. Like just dropped so much wisdom for us, for our audience. And you're so giving with it too. It's really, really amazing.
Thank you. It's fun. It's showing up. Like you just pour on the feast and see what happens.
Oh, thank you for sharing this space with us, Jessie. Seriously, I really appreciate that. And for those who are also kind of like, I'm not sure if what they're doing in their life is what they want to do. I mean, just giving you, just having that experience and having you share your experiences and sort of like giving some of your wisdom, I think it just sets everybody up to start like, going back to being mindful and really checking in with where they're at in their life. So I appreciate that time that you've given us.
Yeah. All right. And Jessie, we do a customary fist bump.
Okay.
To the camera, and boom. All right. And you can check us out at thehealthfeast.com. And we would love it if you would subscribe and share your favorite episodes and leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. And we will see you here next time. Live well and rock on, everyone. Thank you so much.